Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm so thrilled you are joining us right now because today we are embarking on this truly fascinating mission.
Oh, absolutely. It's a big one
It
today.
is massive. We are going to explore the hidden architecture of human connection, of, influence, and ultimately of leadership.
Right.
And to do that, I have brought an absolutely massive, almost intimidatingly large stack of sources to the table today.
I was looking at that stack earlier. It's no joke.
It really isn't.
Yeah.
We are pulling from the neurobiology of introverts, leaning really heavily on Susan Cain's groundbreaking research.
Which is fantastic, by the way.
So good. We've got insights and TED Talks from Pixar master storytellers
Oh.
like Andrew Stanton and leadership visionaries like Simon Sinek. We're digging deep into the rich, almost mythic corporate lore of Southwest Airlines and examining the minds of billionaires. Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Oprah Winfrey.
It's a wildly diverse stack of material.
It really is. I mean, we are jumping from brain anatomy to animated fish to airline logistics. But the incredible thing is, they all point toward the exact same underlying truth about human nature.
They really do. And the mission for this deep dive is to, well, synthesize all of this so we can provide you, the listener, with a definitive shortcut.
A shortcut to what, exactly?
A shortcut to becoming an unforgettable communicator and a profoundly effective leader in whatever space you occupy.
Okay, I love that.
Because for decades, we've been sold this cultural narrative. Especially in the corporate Western business world, we're told that success inherently belongs to the loudest person in the room.
Right, the extrovert ideal.
Exactly, the extrovert ideal. The person who dominates the meeting, who talks the fastest, who physically takes up the most space, who takes the biggest, most aggressive risks.
Yeah, the one banging their fist on the table.
But when you actually look at the biology and when you synthesize all of this source material, you realize that is a complete fabricated myth.
It's just not true.
Not at all. Today is about completely dismantling that myth. We are going to discover how biology, deeply rooted authenticity, and the mechanics of narrative actually drive human behavior.
It's not about being the loudest.
No, it's about understanding how the human brain actually processes information, and more importantly, how it processes connection.
And to kick things off, I want to tease a genuinely bizarre fact to hook you right away. I want you to think about this as we start. How does a cheap 99-cent, slightly creepy, mass-produced plastic horse head bought off eBay,
Such a weird item.
so weird, how does that suddenly turn around and sell for over $60?
It makes no logical sense.
None. What could possibly cause a piece of literal plastic junk to increase in perceived value by over 6,000% in a matter of days?
I love this example.
We are going to answer that exact question, and the answer is going to completely change how you view communication. But first, let's lay the groundwork.
Let's do it.
Let's look at how we communicate our ideas to the world in the first place. And to do that, we need to start with the concept of why. Drawing heavily on Simon Sinek's famous Golden Circle framework.
The golden circle. What's fascinating here is that Sinek's concept is brilliantly simple on its surface, yet it completely upends how 99% of organizations and individuals actually operate day to day.
Okay, let's unpack this. How does it work?
I want you to imagine 3 concentric circles on a piece of paper, like a bullseye.
Okay, got it. Bullseye.
The outermost circle is labeled what, the middle circle is labeled how, and the center, the absolute core of the bullseye, is labeled why.
Okay.
Now, every single organization on the planet, and every person for that matter, knows what they do. That is the easiest part. It's the product you sell, the service you provide, the literal job title you hold.
Like, I am an accountant, or we make shoes.
Exactly. Moving one ring inward, some people and some organizations know how they do it. This might be your unique selling proposition, your proprietary process, the special algorithm, the thing that supposedly sets you apart from your immediate competition.
Right.
But as Sinek points out, very, very few people and organizations know why they do what they do. And to be crystal clear right out of the gate, making money is not a why.
Right. Making money is just a result. It's an output.
Exactly. Making money is the result of the machine working. A why is a purpose. It is a cause or a foundational belief. It's the reason your organization exists in the first place, beyond the financial spreadsheet.
It's the reason you get out of bed in the morning.
And it's the reason anyone else should care.
And here is where we can use a really practical, everyday analogy that Sinek brings up, which perfectly illustrates this. Apple versus a traditional computer company like Dell.
Oh, this is a great comparison.
If Apple communicated like everyone else in the market, they would communicate from the outside of that circle inward. They would start with the what, move to the how, and maybe, if they were lucky, eventually get to the why.
Right.
Their marketing pitch would sound something like this. We make great computers. They're beautifully designed, simple to use, and incredibly user-friendly. Want to buy one?
Which is entirely uninspiring.
Completely uninspiring. It's just a list of facts and features. It's a spec sheet.
Yeah.
But Apple doesn't do that.
Yeah.
Apple starts from the inside of the bullseye and works out. They start with the why. Their core message is, everything we do, we believe in challenging the status quo. We believe in thinking differently.
That's luck.
The way we challenge the status quo is by making our products beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly.
Yeah.
We just happen to make great computers. Want to buy one?
It is a total paradigm shift in how information is presented to the consumer.
It completely changes how you feel about the product.
And that subtle structural shift creates what Sinek refers to as the MP3 player paradox. Think about it practically. We're perfectly comfortable buying a computer from Apple, but we're also perfectly comfortable buying an MP3 player.
Like the iPod?
Like the iPod, or a smartphone, or a smartwatch, or even a streaming television service from Apple. But what if Dell offered you an MP3 player?
I mean, it sounds weird just saying it. A Dell MP3 player, I wouldn't buy it.
Right. But why is it weird? Dell is a massive, highly successful computer company. They are eminently qualified structurally, logistically, and technologically to manufacture an MP3 player or a flat-screen TV.
They definitely have the parts.
They have the supply chains. They have the engineers. In fact, they have actually tried to release these products in the past.
Yeah.
And nobody bought them.
Wow.
We as consumers cannot even comfortably imagine buying an MP3 player from Dell because Dell defines itself strictly by the outer circle, by what it does. It makes personal computers for offices.
That makes so much sense.
Apple, on the other hand, defines itself by the center circle, by why it exists, to challenge the status quo and empower the individual. Because we buy into their why, we are willing to accept almost any what they produce, as long as it aligns with that core, rebellious belief.
So the ultimate takeaway here is that people don't buy what you do.
They buy why you do it.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When I first read Sinek's work, I thought, okay, this is just a very clever marketing heuristic. It's a neat psychological trick for copywriters. But it's not.
No, not at all.
This isn't just psychology. This is deeply physically rooted in our neurobiology.
Yes, this is where I get incredibly excited because we aren't just talking about abstract behavioral psychology here. We are talking about literal human anatomy.
Brain structure.
Exactly. If you look at a cross-section of the human brain from the top down, the physical structure is broken into 3 major components that correlate flawlessly with Sinek's golden circle.
Okay, lay it on me.
Our newest brain, evolutionarily speaking, is the Homo sapien brain, the neocortex. It sits on the outside, and it corresponds exactly with the what level?
So the outside of the brain matches the outside of the circle.
Precisely. The neocortex is responsible for all of our rational thought, our analytical thought, our deduction. It processes facts, figures, features, benefits. And crucially for this discussion, the neocortex is the only part of the brain that processes language.
Okay, so the outside of the brain processes the outside of the circle, the what. And it's the only part that understands words.
Yes. But the middle 2 sections of the brain make up our limbic brain. The limbic system corresponds to the inner circles, the how and the why.
The core.
This older part of the brain is responsible for all of our feelings: trust, loyalty, love, fear. It is also responsible for all human behavior and all decision-making.
Wow.
And here's the absolute picker. The limbic brain has absolutely zero capacity for language. It doesn't process words. It only processes feelings and drives behavior.
So what does this all mean for us practically?
Well, it means that when you pitch someone with facts and figures, when you communicate from the outside in, starting with the what, they can completely understand the vast amounts of complicated information you're giving them.
Their neocortex is firing.
Right. It gets the data, but it doesn't drive behavior. It doesn't actually make them act or sign the contract or join your movement.
I see. Have you ever been presented with a flawless logical argument? All the data points are pointing in the right direction. The spreadsheet is green across the board. The pros heavily outweigh the cons, but you just sit there and say, I don't know, it just doesn't feel right.
Everyone has had that moment.
We use that specific phrase, it doesn't feel right, because the part of the brain actually controlling the decision doesn't control language.
The best we can muster is a feeling, a gut instinct.
When great leaders communicate from the inside out, starting with the why, they are bypassing the analytical bouncer at the door and talking directly to the limbic brain.
They are directly accessing the part of the brain that controls behavior. And then, only after the feeling is established, they allow the neocortex to rationalize that gut decision with the tangible what.
And if we look for historical proof of this limbic resonance in action, the pursuit of powered flight with the Wright brothers is the perfect example.
It really is.
Sinek contrasts Orville and Wilbur Wright with a man named Samuel Pierpont Langley. In the early 20th century, the race to achieve powered man flight was like the dot-com boom of the 90s or the AI boom today.
Everyone wanted to be first. It was the ultimate prize.
And Samuel Pierpont Langley had what any modern venture capitalist would call the absolute perfect recipe for success.
The surest bet you could make. He had a $50,000 grant from the War Department, which was a massive fortune at the turn of the century.
Huge money.
He held a prestigious seat at Harvard. He worked at the Smithsonian. He was extremely well connected to all the greatest minds and politicians of the day, and he had the New York Times literally following him around, documenting his every move.
So the market conditions were perfect.
Perfect. But Langley's why was fundamentally misaligned. He was driven by the outer circle. He wanted to be rich and he wanted to be famous. He was pursuing the result.
Now, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Wasn't Langley just being smart about it? I mean, securing government funding, getting top-tier academic backing, utilizing the press, that sounds like a totally logical, sound business strategy to achieve a massive technological breakthrough.
Oh, absolutely.
So why didn't all that money and logic win?
It's a great question, and it's the trap most businesses fall into. It makes perfect logical sense to the neocortex. But logic doesn't inspire people to bleed for a cause. Langley hired brilliant people, but they were working for the paycheck and the prestige. They were working for the what? Now contrast that with Orville and Wilbur Wright in Dayton, Ohio.
Total opposites.
Completely. They had absolutely no money, zero government grants. They funded their wildly dangerous experiments with the meager proceeds from their bicycle shop.
Which is just crazy.
Not a single person on their team, including the brothers themselves, had a college education. The New York Times wasn't anywhere near them. They were completely ignored by the establishment.
But they had a different why.
Exactly. The Wright brothers were driven by a profound limbic belief, a deep purpose. They believed that if they could figure out this flying machine, it would fundamentally change the course of the world. It would connect humanity.
Wow.
And because they started with that why, the people around them worked with blood, sweat, and tears. They worked for the belief.
The descriptions of their trials at Kitty Hawk are brutal. Every time they went out, they would take these fragile contraptions, launch them, and crash violently into the mud and sand multiple times a day.
It's so dangerous.
They'd pack up the broken pieces, go back, and try again. And they kept going because the mission mattered more than the failure. And then, on December 17th, 1903, they finally took flight.
They did it.
But what I love most about this story is the epilogue. The ultimate proof that Langley was driven by the wrong thing.
Yes, the day the Wright brothers flew, Samuel Pierpont Langley quit.
He just gave up.
Think about that. He doesn't look at their monumental achievement and say, this is amazing for humanity. Let's take my Harvard team and my War Department funding and improve upon this technology. Let's build the next iteration.
Right.
No, he quit because he wasn't first, he wasn't going to get the fame, and he wasn't going to get the riches. He had no underlying why to sustain him once the external validation was gone.
It is a staggering contrast. And we see this exact same limbic resonance, this power of why in massive social movements.
Definitely.
Take Martin Luther King Jr. In August 1963, 250,000 people showed up on the Mall in Washington, D.C. to hear him speak. Now, put yourself in 1963 for a second. There were no websites to check the date.
No cell phone.
No mass email blasts. No social media algorithms pushing the event to the top of a feed. No digital calendar invites. How do you coordinate 250,000 people to travel across the country, many on 8-hour bus rides, in the heat of August?
You certainly don't do it with a logistical flyer. MLK wasn't the only man suffering in pre-civil rights America, and frankly, he wasn't even the only great orator of his time. But he went around talking about what he believed.
Belief again.
He didn't travel the country telling people what needed to change in the tax code or the legal system, the what. He told them his foundational beliefs about human dignity.
And people resonated with that.
Deeply. And people who believed what he believed took his cause, made it their own, and spread the word to their communities. They showed up in Washington, not necessarily for him, but for themselves.
It was what they believed about America that got them to endure the travel and stand in the sweltering sun.
And as Sinek famously points out, MLK gave the I have a dream speech, not the I have a plan speech.
I have a plan. Imagine how deflating that would be.
Right. A 12-point comprehensive plan for legislative reform speaks entirely to the neocortex. It's analytical. It's dry. A dream, a vision of the future, speaks directly to the limbic brain. It inspires action.
This all ties into something called the law of diffusion of innovation, which is a principle that explains how new ideas, technologies, or products spread through a given population.
Yes, and this is crucial for anyone trying to introduce something new to the world. The market is segmented into very specific psychological profiles.
Okay.
The first 2.5% of the population are the innovators. The next 13.5% are the early adopters. Then you have the early majority at 34%, the late majority at another 34%, and finally the laggards.
The laggards.
Those people who only buy touch-tone phones because they don't make rotary phones anymore.
Whoa, hold on. Let me jump in here. That is a lot of percentages in a row. Let's break that down conversationally so we don't lose anyone. Basically, what you're saying is that the market is a bell curve.
Exactly, a bell curve.
Hmm.
On the far left, you have a tiny sliver of people who are obsessed with the bleeding edge, the innovators and early adopters. In the huge fat middle, you have the majority of normal people. And on the far right, you have the holdouts.
Yep.
Now, the fundamental rule of this law is that if you want mass market success, if you want your idea to reach the fat middle of that bell curve, you cannot achieve it until you hit the tipping point.
And what's the tipping point?
A tipping point is located between 15 and 18% market penetration. Why? Because the early majority, the pragmatic folks in the middle, will not try something new until someone else has tried it first and de-risked it for them.
And the people willing to take that risk are the innovators and early adopters on the left side.
Yes. And what defines those early groups is that they are entirely comfortable making gut decisions, limbic decisions. They are driven by what they believe about the world rather than just what practical product is available.
They want to be first.
They are the ones who stood in line for 6 hours in the rain to buy the very first iPhone in 2007. They didn't do it because the technology was flawless, it wasn't, the battery life was terrible, and there was no app store yet.
It barely worked.
Right. They did it because they wanted to be first. Their purchase proved what they believed about themselves, that they are forward-thinking, that they are part of the future.
And to show what happens when you completely ignore this biological reality, Sinek brings up TiVo as a classic cautionary tale.
Oh, TiVo.
For those who remember, when TiVo launched, it was arguably the highest quality, most revolutionary product on the television market. They had great funding, fantastic market conditions. They were so ubiquitous, we still use their name as a verb. Did you TiVo that?
Exactly.
But commercially, out of the gate, the launch was a total failure. They bled money. Why? Because they launched by telling everyone the what. They blasted out marketing that said, we have a product that pauses live TV, skips commercials, rewinds live TV, and memorizes your viewing habits.
And how did the fat middle of the bell curve react to that?
The cynical majority looked at that list of features and said, we don't believe you, we don't think we need that, and frankly, a machine that memorizes our habits sounds creepy and you're scaring us.
It engaged the wrong part of the brain.
They tried to sell purely to the analytical neocortex. If they had started with the why, they would have flipped the script. They could have said, if you're the kind of person who likes to have total, uncompromising control over every aspect of your life, boy, do we have a product for you. It pauses live TV, skips commercials, and lets you watch what you want when you want.
It makes all the difference.
By shifting the framing, they would have hit the limbic brain first, connecting with a core human desire for autonomy.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to ask a pivotal question. What is the absolute best delivery mechanism for the why? We know that starting with why taps into the limbic brain, but how do we package that why in a way that people can actually consume, retain, and be moved by?
And that leads us to storytelling.
Exactly. This brings us to the second massive topic in our stack, the magical science and the physical mechanics of storytelling. Because storytelling isn't just a quaint art form reserved for campfires and children's books, it is a profound biological tool that literally alters human brain chemistry.
Okay, let's unpack this with the story I teased at the very beginning of the deep dive, the significant object study. In 2009, a journalist named Rob Walker wanted to test the objective, quantifiable value of storytelling.
Such a brilliant experiment.
So he went on eBay and bought 200 random, cheap, utterly insignificant thrift store objects. The average price he paid was about $1 each.
Barely anything.
There was a cheap wooden mallet, a cracked ceramic mug, and yes, one of these items was this slightly creepy, mass-produced 99-cent plastic horse head. You know, the kind visible plastic scenes, weirdly painted eyes, just junk.
Literal garbage to most people.
Exactly. So Walker then contacted 200 talented authors and asked them to write a completely fictional, highly compelling, emotionally resonant story for each of these 200 objects.
Okay.
He then took the objects and relisted all 200 of them back on eBay. But this time, instead of writing a standard factual product description like plastic horse head, 3 inches tall, minor wear and tear, he used the fictional stories as the item description. He explicitly stated that the stories were fictional, so he wasn't tricking anyone into thinking these were historical artifacts. He just attached a narrative.
The financial results of this experiment are genuinely mind-boggling. That 99-cent plastic horse head with the weird eyes, it sold for $62.95.
That is insane.
That is a 6,395% increase in value. And when you look at the macro data, Rob Walker spent a grand total of $129 acquiring all 200 objects.
Right.
After simply attaching words, just words, stories, to them, he sold them for a total of $8,000.
Wow.
What this proves, fundamentally and empirically, is that emotional investment completely overrides critical, objective thinking. When we are emotionally invested in a narrative, our neocortex basically takes a vacation.
It shuts down.
The perceived value of that plastic horse head was no longer based on its material worth or its utility. It was entirely based on the emotional resonance of the story attached to it.
That is wild. I mean, someone paid over $60 for something they could dig out of a cereal box just because they like the story. And David J.P. Phillips, who has done incredible research on the neurology of storytelling, breaks down exactly what is happening in the physical brain during these moments of narrative absorption.
Yes, the cocktails.
He calls it the angel's cocktail versus the devil's cocktail. Let's look at the angel's cocktail first. Phillips posits that when you tell a great story, you aren't just an entertainer, you are essentially acting as a neurochemist, manually inducing the release of specific, powerful hormones in your listener's brain.
Precisely. You are mixing a cocktail in their head. The first crucial ingredient in the angel's cocktail is dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that creates intense focus, motivation, and it deeply, deeply enhances memory retention.
It makes you pay attention.
When dopamine levels are high, you are hanging on every single word. The outside world fades away. And how do you trigger dopamine in a story? You do it by building suspense, by launching a cliffhanger.
Right. Phillips tells this great story about himself to illustrate this. He talks about walking into a high-stakes meeting to pitch a corporate training program.
I love this story.
Right before he walks through the boardroom doors, the receptionist casually leans over and tells him, "Hey, just so you know, the 3 men you're pitching to are ex-military, they're the majority owners of the firm, and none of them actually want the training you are about to pitch."
So stressful.
So he is sweating bullets. She literally stops him at the door, calls his name as if to give him one final life-saving tip, and then Phillips pauses the story. He just stops talking.
He leaves them hanging.
He doesn't tell the audience what the receptionist said. And by doing that, he artificially spikes the audience's dopamine. They're intensely focused, waiting for the resolution of that tension. Storytelling is inherently dopamine creating because it sets up an expectation of a resolution. We crave knowing how it ends.
That's a brilliant example. The second ingredient in the angel's cocktail is oxytocin. This is often called the bonding or cuddle hormone. Makes you feel generous, trusting, and relaxed.
It builds a bridge.
It makes you feel deeply human and intimately connected to the speaker. And the most effective way to trigger oxytocin is through empathy and vulnerability. Phillips demonstrates this by telling an incredibly heartbreaking, deeply personal story to his audiences.
One about the little boy.
Yes. He talks about a 5-year-old boy who was so excited to be a big brother. The boy had helped pick out the wallpaper for the nursery. He had picked out a special stuffed animal for his baby brother, only for the parents to discover right before the planned cesarean section that the baby's heart had stopped beating.
It's just devastating.
It's a devastating narrative. And by sharing something so profoundly tragic and vulnerable, he forces the audience's brains to release a flood of oxytocin. Their empathy skyrockets. They bond with him instantly. The distance between speaker and audience completely evaporates.
It's almost manipulative if you think about it, but it's just biology.
Hmm.
And the third ingredient in the angel's cocktail is endorphins. Endorphins make you feel creative, relaxed, and focused. They are natural pain and stress relievers.
And how do we trigger those?
The absolute easiest, most reliable way to trigger endorphins is through laughter. If you can make an audience laugh, you lower their defensive shields and vastly increase their creative engagement with your material.
So if we are doing an ELI 5 summary and explain like I'm 5 recap, here is your goal as a communicator. You want to use suspense to trigger dopamine so they pay attention. You want to use vulnerability to trigger oxytocin so they trust you. And you want to use humor to trigger endorphins so they relax and enjoy the ride. That is the angel's cocktail.
But then on the flip side, there is the devil's cocktail, which is what we desperately want to avoid. The devil's cocktail is made of cortisol and adrenaline.
The stress hormone.
When these stress hormones are high in the brain, people become intolerant, irritable, uncreative, highly critical, and their memory is severely impaired. They literally cannot retain the information you are giving them.
They're in fight or flight.
And sadly, tragically, as Phillips points out, most standard corporate communications, most endless bullet point slide deck presentations in brightly lit conference rooms are absolutely laced with the devil's cocktail. They stress people out, bore them to tears, or confuse them, triggering a flood of cortisol instead of human connection.
To truly master the angel's cocktail and avoid the devil's, we can look at the methodology of some of the greatest storytellers in modern history. The creative team at Pixar.
The legends.
Andrew Stanton and Matthew Loon, who are the masterminds behind films like Toy Story, Finding Nemo, and Wall-E, have a very specific, repeatable playbook for engaging the brain.
How does it work?
Stanton argues that storytelling at its very core is structurally identical to joke telling. You absolutely must know your punchline before you start. You have to know your ending from the very beginning so that every single sentence, every single frame of the movie is purposefully leading the listener toward a singular emotional goal.
And one of the most brilliant concepts they use to keep that dopamine flowing is what they call the unifying theory of 2 plus 2.
This is a crucial concept for anyone in leadership and sales. Humans are born problem solvers. We are biologically compelled to deduce and deduct patterns. A common fatal mistake communicators make is giving the audience the final answer right away. They spoon-feed the audience the number 4.
But the brain hates that.
The human brain doesn't want to be handed 4. The brain wants to do the work. It wants the satisfaction of solving the puzzle. A masterful storyteller, therefore, gives the audience 2 plus 2 and makes them do the math.
Let's give a practical example of this. It's like watching a great mystery movie. If the detective walks in on page 1 and says, "The butler did it," the movie is over. You're bored. That's handing them a 4.
Exactly.
But if you show the butler looking nervous, and then you show a muddy footprint that matches the butler's shoe, you've given the audience 2 plus 2. When the audience puts the pieces together themselves, they gasp. They feel smart, they feel engaged, and they are far more emotionally invested in the outcome because they helped build it.
You have to hide the fact that you are making them work for their meal, but you absolutely must make them work.
Stanton also talks heavily about the character spine, right?
Yes. Every compelling character, whether it's an animated fish in a movie or the founder in a brand story, needs an inner motor, an itch they simply cannot scratch. For Wall-E, his spine, his core drive, was to find beauty in a desolate world.
And Marlin from Finding Nemo.
For Marlin, the overprotective father, his spine was a desperate need to prevent harm. Even when characters make terrible, frustrating decisions, if those decisions are authentically driven by their core spine, we as the audience understand them. We empathize. We release oxytocin.
And then there's the ultimate magic ingredient in the Pixar playbook, invoking wonder. Stanton talks about watching the ice skating scene in the movie Bambi when he was a 5-year-old boy.
Such a classic scene.
Wonder is honest. It is innocent. It bypasses all our cynical defenses and reaches us on an almost cellular level. Giving an audience a moment of pure, unadulterated wonder is the absolute pinnacle of storytelling magic.
And we have to remember why mastering this storytelling is so vital. It goes beyond just being entertaining. It goes back to neuroscientist Yuri Hassan's incredible research at Princeton on something called neural coupling.
This is the brain syncing thing, right?
Yes. Hassan found that when you listen to a well-told story, your brain activity, the actual blood flow and electrical firing in your brain, literally synchronizes with the speaker's brain activity. You are experiencing the narrative together, physically.
That's incredible.
But if you don't provide a story, If you just dump a pile of disconnected facts and figures onto an audience without a narrative structure, you create what is called a narrative vacuum.
And the human brain vehemently hates a vacuum.
Yeah.
If you don't give the brain a coherent, entertaining story to latch onto, it will stubbornly make up its own.
Yes.
This is the exact neurobiological reason why conspiracy theories thrive, especially after massive societal traumas. Think about the aftermath of 9/11. People experience what psychologists call flashbulb memories, where their emotions are highly aroused and their cortisol is spiking.
They're desperate for a story to make sense of the fear.
Exactly. If the factual truth of the event is highly complex, bureaucratic, or emotionally unsatisfying, the brain will literally invent or eagerly latch onto a more entertaining, narrative-driven lie, simply as a coping mechanism to process the overwhelming information.
The brain inherently prefers an entertaining lie over a boring truth.
That's a scary thought, but so true.
Therefore, as a leader, if you don't wrap your facts in a compelling, empathetic story, your audience will invent their own narrative about you, your company, or your product, and I guarantee you, it likely won't be the narrative you want.
Okay, let's unpack this practically. Let's move from theory to reality. How do actual real-world leaders use these storytelling cocktails, this golden circle, to build massive empires and unstoppable corporate cultures? Let's dive into our first major case study, Southwest Airlines.
Southwest is a masterclass in living and breathing a corporate story. They didn't just have a mission statement on a plaque, they had a mythology.
A mythology.
In 1971, they were a tiny, scrappy upstart airline operating solely in Texas. They were flying a Boeing 737 that they affectionately called the Red-Bellied Warrior. But immediately they were hit with massive, crushing legal battles from established giant competitors like Braniff Airlines, who wanted to crush them before they even got their planes off the ground.
They were trying to bankrupt them before they started.
The legal fights were intense, bitter, and existential. It was like a barroom brawl. But Southwest didn't just survive the lawsuits, they weaponized them. They turned that adversity into their founding myth. They positioned themselves in the press and to their employees as the underdog fighting the greedy corporate giants for the common person's right to fly affordably.
And the stories just build from there. One of the most famous pieces of Southwest lore happens in the spring of 1972. They had been fighting so hard, bleeding cash, that they were completely broke. They literally had exactly $143 left in their corporate bank account.
That's nothing.
$143 wasn't even enough to pay the daily wages of a single employee, let alone run a commercial airline. Most rational companies, led by their neocortex, would have folded. They would have declared bankruptcy and gone home.
Of course.
But instead of giving up, the team huddled together and invented the 10-minute turn. They figured out how to aggressively unload, clean, and reload an airplane in exactly 10 minutes so they could keep their limited aircraft in the sky, generating revenue rather than sitting idle and costing money on the tarmac.
That is incredible innovation born from a story of survival.
That $143 crisis, that moment of sheer desperation, birthed an operational efficiency that revolutionized the entire aviation industry.
And the genius of Southwest is that they kept those stories alive. They didn't let them fade into the past. Ginger Hardage, who served as their senior vice president of culture, deeply understood that you have to constantly, relentlessly nourish your culture by sharing stories. Culture doesn't just happen accidentally in a vacuum. It has to be cultivated and managed.
How did she do it?
For example, when they rolled out their profit-sharing plan, they didn't just send out a dry memo explaining the percentages. They heavily promoted the story of Joy.
Who was Joy?
Joy was a part-time model who was working freezing nights at a Christmas tree lot just to make ends meet for her family. Profit sharing wasn't pitched as a financial metric. It was told as the story of how Southwest, as a collective family, saved Joy from financial ruin.
They created a flood of oxytocin around a financial policy.
Exactly. Or consider their response to the tragedy of 9/11. While the rest of the airline industry panicked, grounded flights, and immediately started handing out thousands of pink slips, Southwest leaders huddled in Dallas and vowed to do everything in their absolute power to avoid layoffs. They communicated that they were a family first and a business second, and they backed it up with action.
My absolute favorite Southwest story, though, is the Hurricane Harvey pet lift. In 2017, when Hurricane Harvey devastated Texas, local animal shelters were catastrophically overflowing. Southwest partnered with a rescue center in San Diego, gutted the interior of one of their planes, and literally filled the cabin with orphaned, terrified dogs and cats to fly them to safety.
That is pure, unadulterated oxytocin.
That is empathy in action. They weren't just a logistics company moving metal tubes through the air. They were heroes rescuing puppies from a flood. When you tell stories like that, you can't buy that kind of brand loyalty. It transcends commerce.
Now, let's zoom in and look at how individual billionaire leaders utilize story to shape their specific empires. Let's take them one by one because their approaches are fascinatingly distinct. First, Steve Jobs.
A master storyteller.
Jobs fundamentally believed that the greatest, most world-changing innovations occur exclusively at the intersection of technology and the liberal arts. He actually credited a college calligraphy class he audited for the beautiful typography that defined the early Mac computers.
He understood aesthetics.
He inherently knew that design is how it works, not just what it looks like. But his masterful storytelling wasn't just about selling gadgets, it was about preaching a life philosophy. He famously noted in his Stanford commencement address that death is life's greatest change agent.
That was a powerful speech.
He urged people to remember that their time on Earth is strictly limited, so they shouldn't waste it living someone else's life. He didn't just sell computers, he sold a vision of rebellion, individual expression, and personal empowerment. He sold the why.
Then you have Elon Musk. Musk is essentially a modern polymath, dealing in highly complex physics, aerospace engineering, and global business. But his storytelling is lived. He made himself a great storyteller by actively living a story that is worth telling.
Yes, he places himself right in the center of the narrative.
He casts himself very deliberately as the savior of humanity, fighting against the establishment to transition the world away from fossil fuels and trying to make us a multiplanetary species before an extinction event. When your corporate story is literally, we have to work this weekend to save the human race, you can motivate your engineers to work grueling 80 to 100-hour weeks.
The sheer scale of the narrative provides the immense dopamine and profound sense of purpose required to justify that kind of physical and mental sacrifice.
Richard Branson, however, approaches it from a completely different angle. He has built $12 billion companies across 8 entirely different sectors. But rather than sleeping on the factory floor like Musk, Branson operates from his base on Necker Island in the Caribbean.
It's pretty nice.
Right. He presides over the Virgin Empire with brand storytelling at its absolute heart. His core narrative is built heavily on delegation and trust. He isn't a micromanaging control freak CEO. His story is one of adventure, fun, and playfully disrupting stagnant, boring industries, like airlines or record labels, by simply providing a vastly better, more human customer experience.
He trusts his team to run the day-to-day, and that visible trust, that massive injection of oxytocin, permeates the entire Virgin brand.
What about Tony Hsieh at Zappos? He built a completely transformative culture before he passed away.
Yes, Tony Hsieh was a radical storyteller in the realm of organizational structure. He implemented something called holacracy.
Let me stop you there, because that's a jargon-heavy word. For the listener who hasn't studied organizational management, what exactly does holacracy look like on the actual floor at Zappos?
Fair point. Essentially, holacracy is a system of decentralized management. It completely removes traditional bosses, managers, and the classic top-down pyramid hierarchy. Instead, employees govern themselves in overlapping circles, taking on fluid roles based on the work that needs to be done.
Wow, that's radical.
It is a radical, almost terrifying story of placing absolute trust in your employees' autonomy. And to fiercely protect that specific cultural story, Hsieh implemented a legendary policy. After new hires went through their rigorous multi-week orientation, he would offer them $2,000 in cash to quit on the spot.
Just to walk away.
If you took the money, it meant you were there for a paycheck, not the purpose. You weren't right for the Zappos story. It was a brilliantly expensive way to filter for true believers.
That is incredible. And then look at Brian Chesky at Airbnb. He did something similar, but on a macro societal scale. He essentially took the traditional American dream, which for decades was a narrative about owning your own house with a white picket fence, owning your own car, and keeping up with the Joneses. And he completely shifted the narrative to sharing with the Joneses.
He changed the culture.
He disrupted a $500 billion entrenched hotel industry, not by selling cheaper beds, but by selling the powerful limbic story of belonging anywhere in the world.
We also see this brilliantly deployed with Phil Knight at Nike. Knight realized very early on that Nike wasn't simply selling pieces of stitched rubber and fabric. They were selling stories of human greatness. He actually designated his top executives with the title of corporate storytellers.
That was their actual title.
Yes. They were tasked with sharing the foundational lore of the company, like the famous story of co-founder Bill Bowerman literally ruining his wife's waffle iron in their kitchen to invent the iconic, grippy waffle sole for running shoes. By constantly telling stories of scrappy invention and great athletes overcoming the odds, they inspired a global fitness movement. Nike became a badge of athletic identity.
And finally, rounding out the billionaires, we have to look at Oprah Winfrey. She is arguably the ultimate master of empathy and storytelling in modern media. She operates on the profound, foundational belief that every single person has a story, and that your story, no matter who you are, is just as valid and important as the next person's.
She creates space for people.
By creating a remarkably safe public space for vulnerability on her television show, she triggered massive amounts of oxytocin in her audience every single day, building a multi-billion-dollar empire entirely on a foundation of shared humanity.
So we've talked at length about these massive, larger-than-life figures, Steve Jobs, Oprah, Elon Musk. But let's pause and address you, the listener, directly, because it is very easy to listen to all this and feel overwhelmed.
Yeah, it can feel like a lot to live up to.
What if you aren't naturally loud? What if you aren't a gregarious, spotlight-seeking personality like Richard Branson? What if the mere thought of jumping on a TED Talk stage or even just raising your hand in a crowded boardroom makes you break out in a cold sweat?
I know that feeling intimately. I have definitely been the person hiding in the bathroom stall at a networking event just to get 5 minutes of quiet.
We all have, and this is a vital question to answer, and it brings us to the myth of the extrovert ideal, which is heavily, brilliantly explored in Susan Payne's book, Quiet.
Such an important book.
Society, and particularly the American corporate and educational systems, overwhelmingly praises the extrovert ideal. We idolize the fast-talking, risk-taking, loud personality who loves working in open-plan offices and thrives in group brainstorming sessions. We mistakenly equate volume with leadership.
But the data doesn't support that.
The statistical reality is that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population are introverts. And the distinction between the two isn't just a behavioral preference, it is a hardwired biological reality.
Right. You touched on this briefly earlier, but I want to get really nerdy about the amygdala for a second.
I'd love to. The amygdala is the small, almond-shaped part of the brain that processes memory, decision-making, and emotional reactions to fear and stimuli. To understand how this shapes personality, we look at the renowned Harvard researcher Jerome Kagan.
He did the baby studies, right?
He conducted fascinating longitudinal studies on infants. He would bring babies into his lab and expose them to various new stimuli. He'd play strange voices on a tape recorder, he'd pop balloons, he'd wave cotton swabs with unfamiliar smells like alcohol under their noses. Some babies reacted wildly to this new data. They flailed their arms, they pumped their legs, they cried, their heart rate spiked. Kagan labeled these babies high reactive. Other babies, in the exact same scenario, remained completely calm, quiet, and barely reacted to the popping balloons. They were labeled low reactive.
That makes sense.
Now, counterintuitively, those high reactive babies, the ones who seem the most agitated and expressive, actually grew up to be the introverts.
Wait, let me make sure I'm following this. The babies freaking out and flailing around became the quiet, reserved kids.
Exactly. It seems backward, but it makes perfect biological sense. They reacted wildly because their nervous systems were highly acutely sensitive to novelty. They physically process more data from their environment than other people.
So they get overwhelmed faster.
They have what psychologists call thinner boundaries between themselves and the world's emotions. They feel things deeply and intensely. So when those highly sensitive babies grow up and are placed in a loud, chaotic environment, like a buzzing open-plan office, a noisy classroom, or a frantic networking event, their highly sensitive amygdala gets completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of sensory data.
And that's why they retreat.
They retreat to quiet spaces, like you hiding in the bathroom, not because they are antisocial or hate people, but because they physically need to regulate their nervous systems. Extroverts, on the other hand, the low reactive babies, actually need massive amounts of outside stimulation just to feel anything at all, which is why they actively seek out crowds, loud music, and high-risk environments.
But it's such a liberating concept. And this high reactivity actually gives introverts incredible, often overlooked leadership strengths. Because they have those thinner emotional boundaries, they inherently possess incredibly high empathy. They naturally tune in to how others are feeling. They actually listen to their teams instead of just waiting for their turn to speak. They're far more likely to implement good ideas from subordinates without their ego getting in the way, because they don't need to physically dominate the conversation to feel validated.
They're processing.
They think deeply before they speak, analyzing the data, rather than just reacting on a testosterone-fueled impulse. There is a great quote attributed to Albert Einstein, who was famously an introvert. He once said, "It's not that I'm so smart, it's just that I stay with problems longer." That persistence, that deep solitary focus, is an absolute introvert superpower.
But the harsh reality is, despite those superpowers, we still live in a corporate world that aggressively demands extroverted behavior to get promoted. This is where free trait theory, developed by Professor Brian Little, becomes a survival guide.
What's free trait theory?
Free trait theory explains that introverts are entirely capable of acting extroverted, of turning on the charm, delivering a booming presentation, and dominating a stage, but only for the sake of what he calls core personal projects.
So they can turn it on if they care enough.
If an introvert deeply values their work, their cause, or the people they love, they can fake the extroversion to make it happen. They can intentionally push through the biological discomfort, but, and this is the critical caveat, they can only sustain this performance if they are granted a restorative niche.
They have to recharge.
They desperately need that quiet time afterward to retreat, lower their cortisol levels, and recharge their depleted batteries.
So how does an introvert, or really anyone who feels uncomfortable faking a loud, bombastic TED Talk persona, how do they project genuine authority in a room? Annette Kramer outlines 10 principles for leadership presence, and they are incredibly practical.
Let's hear them.
The first one is entirely counterintuitive. Start by standing still. She tells the story of a high-powered media CEO who used to pace the stage frantically because of nervous energy. She thought it made her look dynamic, but it actually completely undermined her authority. It made her look anxious. A coach finally taught her to walk out to the center of the stage, plant her feet, and stand in absolute silence for 5 full seconds, taking a deep breath before speaking a single word.
That 5 seconds of intentional silence is magical. Try it in your next meeting. It physically lowers the pitch of your voice. It implicitly commands the room to pay attention. And going back to our neurochemistry, it builds intense anticipation, which immediately spikes dopamine in the audience. They are leaning in, waiting for you.
What's the next principle?
Another key principle Kramer advocates is to hold something back. You don't always have to have the last word in an argument or a discussion. In classic sales culture, the mantra is, always be closing. Kramer argues the exact opposite for building relationships and presence, never be closing.
Never be closing.
Leave space for others to contribute. If you, as the leader, dominate every silence and answer every question, you substitute your own ego for the group's collective learning. Holding back shows immense respect and builds deep trust.
She also talks about focusing through your body. We've all heard of Amy Cuddy's famous power poses.
Yeah.
For those who haven't seen the TED Talk, this is the idea that standing in a posture of confidence, like the Wonder Woman pose, with your hands firmly on your hips, your feet wide apart, physically taking up space, even when you don't feel confident, actually changes your biochemistry.
It lowers cortisol and raises testosterone.
Body awareness aligns your intellect and your emotion. You can't just be a floating brain delivering a spreadsheet. Your physical vitality, your posture, lends necessary weight to your words. And perhaps most importantly of all her principles, you have to lead with what you actually care about.
Yes, the story of the blockchain panel she shares is a perfect, striking example of this. Kramer describes attending a tech conference where speaker after speaker got up and gave incredibly dry, highly technical, boring presentations about how blockchain technology would eventually eliminate intermediaries in financial transactions.
Sounds thrilling.
It was pure neocortex data dumping. The audience was literally falling asleep in their chairs. Then one speaker stood up and completely changed the narrative. He didn't use the slide deck. He said he didn't like the sterile word intermediary. He preferred the word guardian.
That's a powerful shift.
He spoke passionately with real emotion about how it was their responsibility to be human guardians of credibility, to keep the technology honest and ethical for the everyday person. Because he spoke from a place of deep personal care, he completely woke up the room. The energy shifted entirely. He engaged their limbic brains by attaching a human why to a technical what.
And all of this, the pausing, the body language, the emotional connection, requires building muscle memory. Kramer compares developing leadership presence to being a master jazz musician. like the legendary drummer Max Roach, or a professional tennis player practicing their serve.
You have to practice your delivery, your storytelling mechanics, and your emotional regulation relentlessly in times of peace.
You practice in front of the mirror or in low-stakes meetings so that when a massive crisis hits, when you have $143 in the bank account like Southwest, your body and mind know exactly what to do without panicking.
As Max Roach beautifully said about the art of improvising, you have to know how far you can go out before you have to come back in. You build that internal muscle memory so you can be completely, unshakably authentic in the high-stakes moment.
So to synthesize this massive stack of material, the hidden architecture of unforgettable leadership is actually quite clear, regardless of your industry. Whether you are building an airline, pitching a new software product, or simply trying to motivate a small team through a tough quarter, you absolutely must start with your why.
You have to speak directly to the limbic brain, bypassing the analytical bouncer of the neocortex.
You then have to package that why into a narrative that manually spikes dopamine through suspense, oxytocin through vulnerable empathy, and endorphins through shared humor.
And finally, you have to deliver that story with an authentic physical presence that honors your natural biological temperament rather than fighting it.
And we want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to chew on after this deep dive is over. Throughout this entire conversation, we've seen how modern society constantly praises the loud, the brash, and the highly extroverted. But I want you to really think about what we just learned today.
It changes everything.
Storytelling, at its absolute core, is fundamentally about empathy. It is about observing the world deeply enough to invoke a sense of wonder and connecting with the vulnerable emotional core of your audience. Neuroscience shows us unequivocally that introverts, with their highly reactive amygdalas, are biologically wired to be hyper-observant.
They have thinner boundaries to the world's emotions. They are biologically predisposed to possess high empathy.
So if we look at the modern landscape, especially with the massive rise of remote work, asynchronous communication, and digital text-based culture where the loud boardroom bully has been muted by a screen, are we finally seeing a shift? Despite society telling us for decades that extroverts own the stage, are introverts actually biologically designed to be the ultimate, most powerful storytellers of the modern digital age?
This raises an important question, and frankly, it is a beautiful thought to reflect on. If the battleground has moved from the loud conference room to the written word and the thoughtful, asynchronous message, the introvert's deep processing is no longer a liability, it is the ultimate advantage. Your capacity to feel deeply is the very tool required to craft the narratives that will change the world.
Thank you so much for joining us in this incredibly deep dive. Take these tools, find your why, mix that angel's cocktail, and go tell a story that matters. We'll see you next time.